My name is Renata Caldwell. I'm a polar law student here at the University of Akureyri, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Alexandra Morton. Alex is a biologist, a researcher, a grandmother, an author, and a wild salmon advocate. She has done groundbreaking research on the damaging impact of ocean-based salmon farms and has been called the Jane Goodall of Canada because of her passionate 30-year fight to save British Columbia's wild salmon. She has co-authored more than 20 scientific papers on the impacts of salmon farming on migratory salmon and has also played a key role in legal battles to protect salmon from those impacts. Her most recent book, Not on My Watch: How a Renegade Whale Biologist Took on Governments and Industry to Save Wild Salmon, has received the 2022 George Riga Award for Social Awareness in Literature. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Alexandra Morton.
Good morning. Can you guys hear me? Industry is trying to access the waters of Iceland. And here in British Columbia, we have had a very powerful experience with this industry. So salmon farms are feedlots. It's because they grow as many animals as possible in as small a space as possible, as quickly as possible. And in doing this, they just break the natural laws that keep salmon healthy. So they have them in high density so that pathogens can move from fish to fish. They're stationary. Salmon are a migratory fish, and when you hold them stationary, all of the waste that they produce stays localized, as well as the pathogens. They keep the predators out. Predators are just this incredible, they provide this incredible service to us in that they remove the sick and the contagious. And in the case of British Columbia, we really just have 3 Norwegian companies. And so they brought their fish with them, which were, of course, Atlantic salmon, which are not natural to the Pacific. And as well, they're monoculture. So the genetic diversity is low, and anything that gets in them and can spread easily. There's no resilience built in. And when this industry first wanted to come to Canada and wanted to bring the Atlantic salmon, everybody knew this was a huge risk. And fisheries managers within the government wrote letters saying things like, we're playing Russian roulette. We're going to import potentially a virus that we have never even heard of, that we don't know exists, so we can't screen for it. But it was trade laws that interrupted the precautions that these scientists wanted to exert, and these managers, because the companies just said, if we can't bring in Atlantic salmon, our prize livestock, basically, like farmers would want to bring in their prize Black Angus cattle or Guernseys or whatever. They said, we won't be competitive on the market. And so they convinced everyone, and in they came. Now, there was something a little bit off with this relationship between this industry and the government of Canada. And I see this in other places too. There was recently a book written about the salmon farming industry in Tasmania, which is completely different companies. But they say the same thing, and that is the companies really win over the confidence of the government, to the point where the government knows there's some impacts, but they don't really want to tell the public. And what I was going to show you here is a memo, an internal memo in Fisheries and Oceans Canada, written in 1991. And the guy said, look, people are worried about Atlantic salmon getting out of the pens and establishing in the rivers and out competing the Pacific salmon. And he writes, do we prepare the public for the possibility now and strategically plant the seed? Or do we downplay the idea and deal with the situation when it occurs? So, instead of, what this really speaks to is there was a defensive mechanism built right away that protected the industry from the scrutiny of the public. They knew the public were concerned, and their response was to basically hide this. Now, fortunately, the colonization of Atlantic salmon didn't happen in our rivers as far as we know. But it just, this attitude pervaded many, many aspects of the industry. So in 2010, I was part of a big commission that looked into why the biggest salmon runs we have, the Fraser River sockeye, biggest salmon run in the world, why they were declining. They cut back fisheries. They looked at the river temperatures and the habitat. They did all kinds of analyses, but nothing fit with this decline that began in the mid 1990s and just kept going unchecked. And so they held a huge commission and they made documents available to the participants, such as myself. And I read about the disease symptoms that were in the farm salmon. I became very concerned. And so while I have no background in virology, I teamed up with a couple of people and began taking samples of farm salmon. I just went to the supermarkets and the sushi restaurants because the farmers wouldn't allow me to go to the farms and sample their fish, but their product was there in the stores, in the restaurants, fresh. And so I did my sampling there. And we came across infectious salmon anemia virus, which is in the influenza family. It's an internationally reportable virus. It's no country wants it. And that's why it's reportable, so that if a country has it, another country can prohibit the import of the product without tripping any trade laws. In other words, they have the permission to exclude the product. And so when we began to get positive test results for this virus, it caused a lot of controversy. And we not only got positive PCR tests, but we also got genetic sequence, which really, you can't get genetic sequence unless you have a piece of the virus there. And these PCR positive results were highly associated with the salmon from the markets, the farm salmon from the markets, but also to wild salmon exposed to these farms. So this was just, a huge concern. But the industry and the government just dismissed the findings completely. We did publish in the Journal of Virology in 2016. It was a very difficult paper to get published because it is a reportable virus. And yet Canada just decided to ignore this, which, is behavior that is just dangerous. And in this world where everything is so connected by trade, it was very, very concerning. And then, so you remember back when I said that some of the fisheries managers worried about a virus that we'd never heard of, maybe coming to Canada. Well, that exactly has happened. And the virus is called Piscine orthoreovirus. I'm sure you guys have it too. It's very, very common in Norway, and now it's very, very common here. And we never got eggs directly from Norway, but we did get eggs from Iceland, which were infected, and we also got eggs from Scotland. And the genetic strain of Atlantic salmon that we got was called the Movi strain, which was a Norwegian strain. So what has gone on is in 2013, I published the first paper on this virus being in British Columbia. And it's not because I was the first one to find it, but I was the first one allowed to publish because government scientists found it as well, and their work was unable to be published. And then a researcher from England, Dr. Gideon Mordecai, he began to look at all the genetic sequence of this virus that any scientist had found. And there's this remarkable gen bank where virologists are posting their genetic sequences for all sorts of viruses. I'm sure it's just going, really strongly with COVID right now. But he was able to go in and find all of these and produce a genetic tree. And his work said, okay, this virus is from Norway. It has also gone to Chile. And also the virus that was in British Columbia has gone to Chile. So viruses have fingerprints and you can trace them. And so he did all of this. And yet the Canadian government and the salmon farming industry just said, no, this virus is local. And they said it's harmless. So, so other researchers did the work to find that no, it actually wasn't harmless. It got into the red blood cells of Pacific salmon. It takes over the red blood cells, and in Atlantic salmon, the fish have evolved to release the virus slowly, and it does damage their heart a little bit and their muscles, but they can recover if they're given enough time. In other words, if they're in a pen protected from predators. But in Pacific salmon, the red blood cells don't release it and they just rupture. And so what happens is hemoglobin floods the fish's system and they turn yellow. And so it's a huge indicator. I mean, you can just see it when you see the fish. And these yellow salmon are showing up all over the place, even into Alaska, because fish move, they get infected, they keep moving, viruses move, everything is very fluid, as we have just so painfully learned over the last 2 years. Now in Canada, we have a law that says you cannot put a fish infected with a disease agent into the water. And so what happened was the blockage of this science that was being published in major journals throughout the world was ignored, and the virus was never designated a disease agent. I took Canada and Marine Harvest to court, and I won, but it still didn't change. And so it spread, and we are now hoping that it doesn't further mutate, but we know it is in our Pacific salmon. And I was in a workshop 2 days this week, and one of the young researchers there has gone out and caught a lot of young wild Chinook salmon, and he takes a tiny little non-lethal sample, lets them go, and he found that a 10% increase of this virus in our wild fish was associated with a 23% decline in their survival. So it was very dangerous. And so as this industry approaches Iceland, and you hear things about it, it's very, very important that you have independent researchers with access to the farms doing this kind of work. But the problem is, it's just, you cannot have this unnatural feedlot system in the natural environment, because what happens is the pathogens multiply so easily in the farms, and then nature wants to deal with it. She wants to reduce their population. She wants to get rid of the contagious, but you just can't with the nets and the barriers. And we see this also with sea lice. So I was actually studying killer whales, and I'd found this amazingly beautiful place, a remote archipelago on the coast of British Columbia. And when the salmon farming industry came in, I thought it was a great idea. We were tiny one, community with a one-room school, and I thought, it would produce jobs and bring in families. But within a few years, I became a sea lice researcher, because nobody in Canada had ever seen the amount of sea lice that were suddenly on our little salmon, as they were just leaving the rivers to go to sea. And so I blew the whistle in 2001, and it took a few years, but the government got involved and said, okay, let's just limit it to 3 adult lice per farm salmon. And so the salmon farming industry were like, okay, we're going to use a drug called slice, emamectin benzoate, and we're going to keep our lice down. And in the graph I was going to show you, from 2007 through 2014, they really did keep their lice down. And the number of lice on the young fish around the farms also went down. It worked. But in 2015, the trend began to reverse itself, and the number of lice started to go up. And what is happening here is also happening in Norway, and that is drug resistance. Sea lice are this little parasitic crustacean that crawl all over the fish. They use suction and to stay on the fish. And it turns out they are remarkable at adapting to everything the salmon farmers do to get rid of them. They even so they use cleaner fish in Norway that go and nibble the lice off of the farm salmon. And when sea lice first molt, so they change their body shape for the first month. When they first molt, they're transparent and very hard to see. And then as they get older, it darkens up. Well, they learned not to darken up, to just stay transparent because the cleaner fish just couldn't see them. They've become resistant to every single drug. And here in British Columbia, where wild salmon are very important to people, and I suspect it's similar in Iceland. I know you have incredible rivers and a very, very precious sport fishery on them. But the relationship here is maybe even broader in that First Nations, the indigenous communities, they call themselves the salmon people. They don't feel they can survive without them. And so the salmon farming industry is being pushed to its limit to try to remove these lice. And so they have brought in these enormous ships from Norway. They cost $30 million or more, they say. And they are sucking all the fish in from the farm. So there's 600,000 to 1 million fish in a farm, and they have them in different pens. So they'll suck in an entire pen and they'll soak them for 6 hours in fresh water, which is supposed to kill sea lice, or they soak them in a hydrogen peroxide solution. Or they have these other boats where they suck the fish in and they run them through these chambers, and they basically, I don't know if you know what a power washer is, but they have jets of water that are trying to just push the lice off. That's not even working. Now they're trying jets of water and brushes to brush each fish. Well, of course, now you're taking the slime off the fish and the scales, and we're seeing disease outbreaks following this treatment. And some of the research I've been doing this last winter is to take a plankton net, which is a very, very, very fine screen net in the shape of a cone, a long cone, and just dragging it around in the water that's coming out of these boats, because it's against the law in Canada to release the sea lice from these vessels. Well, of course, they are releasing sea lice because sea lice are tiny when they're young, and there's a massive amount of slime from these fish, and the filters are just must be getting clogged, and they need to have a certain size to get them out. And unfortunately for the industry, it's not working. Farms that they treated just 30 days ago already have an average of close to 30 juvenile lice per fish. So remember, the limit is 3 adult lice. You've got 30 juveniles. They're going to grow up in the next few days, and they're way over the limit. And the wild salmon populations in British Columbia are just tumbling. Rivers that had 50,000 fish have a couple of hundred. Some rivers have none at all. And so every spring I spend a lot of time counting sea lice and checking the young fish as they come out of the rivers. And what I see is that they're beautiful and clean and silvery when they leave the river, and then they get to the farms and they get their first sea lice, and then they get to the next farm and they get more lice, and they show all kinds of disease symptoms of open sores or popped out eyes or darkened skin, and they just they're lying on the surface a few kilometers past the third farm, and the birds are picking them up and eating them. And so with these boats now, I'm studying a process which is very well, it's interesting, but it's very lethal, and that is, it would appear that when they take the fish and they suck them into the boat, the fish becomes stressed, and somehow there's a communication that the stress is coming out through their skin, and the sea lice are picking up on it, and it would appear that they are just releasing their eggs. Just they're having explosive hatches. I'm finding the eggs in the water. I'm finding these long egg strings where the eggs are supposed to be stacked up like hockey pucks. I'm finding them broken or half empty, or lice hatching inside the eggs. it's just this kind of chaotic, get off the fish, get off the fish, go into the ocean. Let's run the risk, but let's get off this fish because this fish is in trouble. And once again, the work is being ignored. The problem for the salmon farming industry here is that they never were made to behave, to meet the expectations of Canadians. And so they just get farther and farther and farther away from a good corporate image. They nobody likes them unless they work for them, and even then it's a bit iffy. So in 2016, a group of First Nations who I joined we just went and stood on the farms for 280 days. We built houses. People donated solar panels. Some of the young women had an inflatable unicorn that they had tied up and would rest in. And what happened but everything was very peaceful. We never were rude. We weren't abusive. There was no vandalism. We were just there. And what this led to was the leadership of these nations was like, okay, we know we have to deal with this. And now this is at the top of the list because there was a lot of young women on the farms and, people were worried. And so they went into talks with the provincial and federal governments. And in 2018, a deal was struck that the nations now took control of the Cermak and Maui farms. And they had control of what went into the farms, and they got to test the fish before they went in for disease. And they are on the farms counting the sea lice. They are, setting the rules, and they're allowed to remove permanently 1 or 2 farms every year. And so 8 farms are now gone from the migratory path of the juvenile salmon. And of course, things are cleaning up. And then an incredible thing happened in 2020. Our then Minister of Fisheries, Bernadette Jordan, told the industry they could no longer put farm salmon into 19 salmon farms on the migration route of the Fraser River sockeye. So these sockeye began this unchecked decline, as I mentioned, in the mid-90s. Which was, by the way, exactly when the salmon farms went on to their migration route. Now that's just a correlation, and in it, the loss of the fish could be due to something else, but it at the very least means that, this industry needs to be scrutinized, and the impact of it and solutions have to be found. You can't just ignore it. So she did this, and it was a huge shock to Cermak, Maui, and Grieg, which were the 3 companies that were in that area. And so last spring, I went down there to look at these fish that were migrating through, look at the young pink and chum and sockeye salmon from the Fraser River that were going to go through that area. And they were beautiful. I mean, I've been doing this since 2001, and I'm used to looking at fish that are suffering. There's also this thing that happens where their eyes get kind of this gray film over it. We don't even know what that is, but these fish didn't have that. Their eyes were jet black. I thought after looking at thousands of fish for, 20 years that I knew what they looked like. But what I didn't realize, I thought they had a rounded back and flat sides, but they don't. They were plump. They were so plump that there was little shadows created by their big rounded bellies underneath. They were just incredible. And the number of sea lice on them dropped 95%. And I'm going to go back this spring because there was one farm on the edge of the archipelago then that was operating, and that one's gone now. And I plan to go down there again this spring to look. A global assessment of the impact of aquaculture on wild salmon was done. It was quite a few years now ago, but they did a meta-analysis where they looked at all the places that there's wild salmon across the Northern Hemisphere, Canada, Alaska, Russia, Scotland, Ireland, the UK, Norway. And they just said, look, wherever there's salmon farms, the wild salmon are not surviving. And, to put it in a really graphic way that is maybe easier for us to understand, because the ocean looks like such a big place sometimes that maybe you could do something like this and it wouldn't have an impact. But these pathogens are designed to spread in the water. They spread really well. They spread tens of kilometers, including like larval sea lice, the viruses, the bacteria. And they just said there's no place in the world that wild salmon are thriving in the presence of salmon farms. But when we look to Alaska is having huge runs of wild salmon. Now, they are a little bit further north, and so the impacts of climate change, which the last speaker was telling us about, with the reduction of snow in the mountains, which has a huge impact on the rivers for wild salmon. Alaska has less of that impact, so that's probably part of why their runs are better, but they don't have salmon farms. And this summer, we're going to get the first returns of fish that went through the area that Minister Bernadette Jordan cleared of salmon farms. And so we're going to have a look ourselves for the first time. Any country, anywhere in the world is going to have a look at what happens when you take these farms out in a big scale. And so, of course, I'm really looking forward to that. Now, the industry is facing a problem in that all of their licenses, all their federal licenses are scheduled to expire on the 30th of June of this year, just, because they expire every few years and they have to be renewed. And up until now, the renewal of these licenses has been a routine event. It wasn't questioned, it just happened. But now there is huge concern. First Nations are terrified that their rivers are almost, fish are almost extinct. And, the numbers are so low that I have to wonder whether the salmon can come back from it, because they are designed to move in huge numbers and they attract predators from fish to birds. And then when they're bigger, of course, then there's the bears and the whales. But they're so small now. Like when I first began the work on the sea lice, there was just kilometers and kilometers of this like 2-meter wide swath of millions of little tiny salmon all headed towards the open ocean. But now when I go to look for them, it's like there's nothing. And then, there's a little school of 60 or 80, 120, so small that a single family of seabirds can finish them off. So it's very unclear whether these salmon farming licenses are going to be renewed. The relationship between Canada and Norway has always been very good, but I know that this is putting pressure on that relationship. But to Iceland, so you had an amazing person who kept the salmon farming industry at bay. His name was Ori Vickerson. And as I understand it, he bought up commercial licenses for wild salmon to protect them. And he's passed away, and now the salmon farming industry seems to think it can come into Norway. And I just want to say to you, it hasn't worked anywheres. And part of the problem is because the industry was never forced to clean up, and they were never forced to meet the expectations of Canadians. And this has put them in a very compromising position. If from the very beginning, the government had said, hey, look, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this, but you could do this, you could move onto land, we will help you. We want your industry, we want aquaculture, we think there's some benefits to this. But they didn't do that. And Maui, Cermak, and Grieg are just dedicated to the open nets, which is, there's no farmers that dump all their waste. It's literally tons per day per farm, because what goes in does come out. And so I'm hoping that Iceland can see that. We are tracking the Icelandic strain of PRV through British Columbia because it has a different look. And so we know that it was put into farms in Washington State, and there was a huge escape. I think it was in 2017. And those fish were caught up here. And yeah. And where I first found that strain was in Whole Foods in salmon that were being sold from Iceland. That's how we knew initially that it was from Iceland. So yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm really sorry I couldn't give you the presentation. I did try my best, but the firewall situation is just out of control sometimes with these computers. But I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So at least I could follow your talk so well. And this was, even without the slides, brilliant. I think we have a question in the audience, and we have a mobile microphone, which I hope is working.
Oh, it's not working.
It's not working.
Forced me to come down to the stage. It's working now. Oh, fantastic. Oh, all that pointless exercise.
Yes.
Alexandra, I'd like to thank you for your absolutely marvelous presentation. You handle it like a trooper, even without the slides. So thank you very, very much. I don't have a stake. I'm a microbiologist by training, so I don't really pay too much attention to fish species, but many of my colleagues do. I was actually wondering if I could ask you more of a general question. I'm somewhat concerned by this lack of evidence-based decision-making that seems to be very popular with policymakers these days. And what you described, I find very alarming. I think we've seen similar trends with this idea that, big business can regulate itself, whether it's big fish, big oil, et cetera. Do you have any recommendations for those of us people in the sciences in terms of sort of how to advocate for better evidence-based decision-making, among policymakers? Because I don't know about other folks in the sciences, but I don't see myself as a policy person. I think that's the role of other people. But it seems increasingly like there's more need for scientists on the front lines of some of these fights to step up. So I was just wondering if you could speak to, what recommendations you might have for the next generation of scientists coming up based on your own lived experiences.
Yes. So when you bring up next generation, we have now in British Columbia a loose association of young scientists, and they're determined, they're excellent, they are top-notch scientists, but their greatest quality is that they're brave. And this is how this science is suppressed, because if you wanted to be in fisheries as a scientist, you were either going to work for the salmon farming industry or you were going to work for the government of Canada. And so anybody who dared say there was impact from this industry and crossed policy that way, you would not have a job. And so it's a terrible burden to put on the next generation, but we have this remarkable group of young scientists who just don't care. But they are wonderfully kind in their presentations. They're generous in their in their rating of other work. They are not strident. And so all I can say is band together and support each other and go visit the politicians. They cannot be insulated from you. I mean, one of the things trying to get going, trying to get going here is that we change the structure of our Fisheries and Oceans Canada so that there's a conduit for science, because the government has insulated itself from the science that's coming from universities and from non-government organizations, and certainly from me. Nobody wants to hear from me in government. So, but if you band together, I think that is the only hope. But it is a thankless task, and it's not the pathway to financial security, to be able to support your family. It's been a struggle every step of the way. I just published a book last year called Not on My Watch, where I chronicled this whole thing. But I think the answer is to band together I'd also like to say that governments look afraid to me. They've gotten us into a situation that they don't know how to get out of. And I think they're more, perhaps, hopefully, they're more open to answers. So yeah, bravery is really one of the most important assets right now to scientists.
If I could just ask a follow-up question, it seems to me that the policymakers and obviously the people that are direct stakeholders and farm salmon have kind of sold the future, on at their kind of at their own peril. I mean, I'm just kind of wondering, could you comment on sort of the thinking here? I mean, is it as simple as prioritizing short-term gains over long-term losses and privatizing, or sorry, what's the word? Externalizing, the long-term costs in favor of the short-term profit? Is that really as simple as it is, or is there some other thinking or some other piece of psychology going on here?
I have thought a lot about that. I've wondered whether they see the impact on wild salmon as an economically advantageous impact. I'd hate to think that that is true, but it's certainly, I mean, it's a reality. There are no longer wild salmon for sale commercially in British Columbia. There's a few here and there, but chefs in New York are saying, look, we don't even bother with British Columbia anymore because you guys just can't reliably deliver. We go to Alaska. But I also think it's the corporate structure. I think when you think about their constitutions of these companies and their responsibility to their shareholders, I think shareholders are the most dangerous animal on this planet right now because they don't see the consequences of their actions. I know it's getting better. People are getting more concerned, but yeah, I wonder about these companies because they're killing themselves off. These viruses are becoming more virulent because the strategy for a virus on a wild fish is to, look at the long game. They want to stay with that fish for its whole life. But in a farm like this, there is no long term. Everybody's going to die in 2 years. So the strategy for the viruses becomes go hard, propagate as much as you can. And that's called virulence. So these companies are destroying themselves. And the problem is it's going slower than the destruction of the wild salmon, but their economic thinking is beyond me. But I just think they also are trapped into the quarterly payments to their shareholders. And I spoke to the CEO of Marine Harvest in 2009, and she said, look, I have to make the share price go up 4 times a year. And I can only do that I can't control price, but I can control the number of fish I have in the water. So she was answering my question I said to her at the time, I said, you just need to get off our migration routes. Just move over off the major migration routes. But she said, I can't do that. And that's when I realized, okay, you guys got to get out completely. So yeah, they don't have the long strategy in mind. Otherwise, they would have gone to closed containment and they would have gotten a lot of help doing that. But they're whining and arguing about it. Oh, we can't make money. Oh, we can't make money. Yeah, you guys didn't make money in the beginning with the nets either, but you could do this. However, farming Atlantics or salmon is just not a good idea. You're basically farming wolves. You're feeding chickens to the wolves and you're eating the wolves. If you really want to make money with aquaculture, you need to start with algae in a closed environment. Create your own ecosystem and start from the bottom and work up. Grow a fish that eats the algae. Take the waste of everybody and grow a vegetable crop. Or start over with your algae. Create something that actually makes food, because farming salmon doesn't make food. They go fishing first. They fish hard and catch small anchovies, herring, all kinds of small oily fish. And they grind it into feed. And oh yes, they add a lot of grain products and they're trying to increase that percentage of grain products. But the salmon just can't digest it. And it doesn't really matter because they're growing. So even though they're reducing the percentage of wild feed, they're making more feed. So they are fishing down the oceans. Well, there's an end game there. The oceans just can't do it. So the whole idea does not make sense. But if you started with algae and you grew a fish that ate the algae and did this loop, oh yeah, you could make food.
Well, I'd like to thank you and please, please, please keep up the good fight. Thank you so very much.